There's a kind of pain that doesn't bleed, leaves no visible scars, but corrodes from the inside like rust on old metal. Margaret felt that pain when she stepped off that train in 1883 and saw disgust in Silas's eyes. It wasn't just rejection. It was something worse. It was being measured, weighed, and discarded in a matter of seconds. "You're not good enough," those cold eyes said before his mouth even opened. And when it did, I was expecting someone who'd fit in my arms, not break them. The laughter from the men on that platform still echoes in this story. You know that moment when you realize you trusted the wrong person, when you believed promises written on cheap paper. Margaret knew that abyss. But here's the secret nobody tells you about women like her. When the world pushes you to the bottom, you can either sink or build yourself a new floor. She chose fire. What about you? When was the last time someone underestimated your strength? The journey from Illinois to Wyoming took 4 full days. 4 days staring out the train window, imagining what Silas would be like in person, mentally rehearsing that first embrace, that first smile. Margaret had reread his letters so many times the paper edges were worn thin. A woman of substance, he'd written. Someone who's not afraid of hard work. She was exactly that. Would he be the man of pretty words? December's cold bit at her face when she finally stepped onto that wooden platform. Dry Creek was smaller than she'd imagined. A handful of buildings scattered about, mountains in the distance, endless sky. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it wanted to escape her chest. There he was, dark hat, leather coat, rigid posture. Silas Brennan didn't smile, didn't even move. Margaret took 3 steps toward him, heavy suitcase in her right hand. 3 steps that felt like an eternity. That's when she saw it. That look. Have you ever realized someone rejected you before even meeting you? It's like having a door slammed in your face without warning. His eyes swept over her body from head to toe, calculating, judging, condemning. "You, Margaret?" His voice sounded hollow, without warmth. She nodded, trying to smile despite the tightness in her throat. "The letters didn't mention your size." The air grew thick. 2 men near the station stopped talking, clearly listening to everything. Margaret felt blood rush to her face, but kept her chin up. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of watching her crumble. "The letters apparently didn't mention a lot of things," she responded, voice steady despite the internal trembling. Silas took a step back, as if she were contagious. "I was expecting someone who'd fit in my arms, not break them." The men's laughter tore through the frozen silence. It was like a slap. No, worse than a slap. It was like being stripped naked in the town square. What do you do when someone humiliates you in front of strangers, when they rip away your dignity like it's old newspaper? Margaret could feel every eye on her, the woman in the general store window, the boy near the horses, even the dog seemed to be judging. Silas was already turning his back, not even waiting for a response, as if the matter was settled. "Wait!" The word came out stronger than Margaret intended. Silas stopped, but didn't turn around. He spoke over his shoulder, as if she didn't even deserve to be looked at face to face. "I've got nothing to wait for. The stage goes back east on Friday. I suggest you be on it." And then he just walked away, boots thudding on the wood, leaving her there with her suitcase, the cold, and the humiliation. In that moment, Margaret had 2 very clear choices. She could get on the first train back and let that miserable man win, or she could do something he'd never expect. You know what the problem is with underestimating a woman who crossed an entire country alone. You never imagine what she's truly capable of. And Margaret was just getting started. The boarding house was across the main street, a 2-story building, paint peeling, but smoke rising from the chimney, a sign of life, of warmth. Margaret picked up her suitcase and walked toward it, ignoring the curious stares. Every step was a declaration. Every step said, "I'm not leaving." Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying the person who hurt you. It's proving you never needed them in the first place. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Ruth, was a woman with greying hair and eyes that seemed to see right through people. "You the Silas bride?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Was. Now I'm just Margaret." Ruth studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Room's 50 cents a night. Breakfast included." There was no pity in those eyes, just respect. And that's what Margaret needed in that moment. In the small room, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the mountains, Margaret finally allowed the tears to fall. But they weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of anger, of humiliation, yes, but also of something deeper. They were tears of liberation. Because in that moment she realized a simple truth. Silas Brennan had done her the greatest favor possible. He'd shown her who he really was before it was too late. Have you ever been grateful for a door that slammed in your face? The first week in Dry Creek was an exercise in pure survival. Margaret had enough savings for 2 weeks at the boarding house, maybe 3 if she ate sparingly. After that, complete unknown. She could go back to Illinois, sure, but going back meant admitting defeat. It meant hearing the "I told you so" from the neighbors. It meant being the woman who wasn't good enough, that she wouldn't do ever. So Margaret did what she knew best. She sewed. Not literally, not yet. First, she observed. She'd sit on the boarding house porch every afternoon, pretending to read, but actually cataloguing every person, every movement, every need in that small town. There's a secret nobody teaches you about starting over. Before you act, you need to understand the terrain. And she was mapping every inch of that place. That's when she noticed something interesting. The women of Dry Creek wore faded clothes, mended, some clearly inherited or bought from travelers. There was no seamstress in town. The general store sold fabric, but nobody there knew how to transform it into something worth wearing. Can you see an opportunity where others see only cloth? Margaret could. On the 5th morning, she came down for breakfast in her best outfit, a navy blue dress she'd made herself, with white lace details on the collar. Simple, but impeccable. Mrs. Ruth stopped mid-pour. "Who made that dress?" Margaret took a sip of coffee before responding, letting the question hang in the air. "I did." The silence that followed was musical. "You're a seamstress?" Ruth's voice had a different note now. Interest, possibility. Margaret nodded. "I apprenticed with the best dressmaker in Chicago for 3 years. I work with women's clothing, but I also do mending, alterations, anything with fabric." Was she exaggerating? Maybe a little, but survival isn't a place for modesty. It's a place for selling what you've got. Ruth sat down at the table, something she clearly didn't do with just any guest. "I'll be straight with you, girl. That dress is 5 years ahead of anything the women wear around here. If you can do that with a piece of cloth, you can make money in this town." She paused. "But you'll need a place to work. And you'll need to deal with the fact that Silas Brennan's gonna tell his version of the story to anyone who will listen." And there was the real challenge. It wasn't just about sewing clothes. It was about stitching together a reputation in a town where the man who rejected her had probably already painted her as the villain. How do you rebuild your image when someone's already destroyed it first? Margaret had a theory. You don't rebuild. You build something new, something so solid that lies can't tear it down. "Let him talk," Margaret said, and her voice had a firmness that surprised even herself. "Words are wind. Work is proof." Ruth smiled, the first genuine smile Margaret had seen since arriving in Wyoming. "I've got a room in back I don't use for anything. You can work there. I'll take 20% of what you earn as rent." It wasn't charity. It was business, and Margaret preferred it that way. The small room had a good window, natural light, essential for precision sewing. Margaret spent her last dollars on basic fabrics, thread, and some notions at the general store. That's where she saw him for the first time, Eli Cartwright. He was carrying flour sacks, muscles working beneath his simple shirt, glasses fogged from the effort. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention, and maybe that's exactly why she noticed. Eli looked at her when Margaret passed with her packages of fabric. It wasn't the assessing look she'd learned to hate. It was something different, curiosity maybe, or just the politeness of someone taught to acknowledge strangers. He nodded. She returned the gesture, and that was it. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable, just two strangers acknowledging each other in a small town. So why did her heart speed up a little? Maybe because kindness, after so much cruelty, feels like a miracle. That night, Margaret sewed until her fingers ached. She made 2 simple aprons, practical with deep pockets, the kind of thing women who worked hard needed. The next morning she hung them on the boarding house porch with a handwritten sign, "Custom Sewing, Fair Prices." It was a humble beginning, but all empires start with a first brick, don't they? And Margaret was ready to build hers, stitch by stitch, choice by choice, day by day. The aprons sold before noon. 2 farm wives bought them, impressed by the reinforced pockets and invisible stitching. "How much do you charge to make a Sunday dress?" one of them asked. Margaret calculated mentally. Fabric, time, margin for error. $3 if you provide the fabric. $5 if I provide it. The woman didn't hesitate. "I want 2. I'll bring the fabric tomorrow." It was amazing how things changed when you had something people wanted. Suddenly, Margaret wasn't the rejected bride anymore. She was the new seamstress. Identities are funny like that, fluid, moldable, dependent on who's telling the story, and Margaret was determined to write her own narrative this time. Have you noticed how work can redefine who you are? A week later, she had 6 orders. She worked from 6 in the morning until midnight, fingers flying over fabric, needle dancing in the rhythm her mother had taught her years ago. "Every stitch is a prayer," Mama used to say. "You're sewing more than cloth, you're sewing intentions." Margaret didn't know if she believed that, but she liked the idea. Every dress that left her hands carried a piece of her. It was during one of those solitary work nights that she heard a soft knock on the door. Past 9 o'clock, late for visitors. Margaret opened cautiously and found Eli Cartwright standing there, holding a package wrapped in brown paper. "Sorry to bother you so late," he said, voice low and respectful. "Mrs. Ruth mentioned you're always running out of black thread. The store got a shipment today." It wasn't just the kindness of the gesture that surprised her. It was the fact that he'd paid attention. How many people really pay attention to others' needs without expecting anything in return? Margaret took the package, fingers brushing his for a second. "How much do I owe you?" Eli shook his head. "Nothing. Consider it a welcome gift, even if it's late." They stood there for a moment, the night's silence wrapping around that unspoken conversation. Margaret noticed details she'd missed before, the lines around his eyes, marks of someone who'd spent years under the sun, the calloused hands but careful, the wire-rimmed glasses that seemed out of place on a man clearly accustomed to heavy work. "Do you read?" The question came out before she could think better of it. Eli smiled, a small smile that completely transformed his face. "When I can. The store owner lends me books sometimes." He paused. "Do you read?" And there it was, a door opening. A real conversation, not about work or weather or superficial things, about something that mattered. Margaret nodded. "Dickens, Bronte, anything I can get my hands on." "Then you'll like this." Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a thin book, worn cover. "Great Expectations. Mrs. Martha said she won't need it for the next few weeks." He extended the book. "Thought you might like company during your sewing nights." How did he know she sewed alone at night? How did he know the silence sometimes weighed more than any needle? Margaret took the book like it was gold. In a way, it was. "Thank you, Eli." It was the first time she'd said his name aloud. It sounded natural, comfortable, like she'd known him for years, not just weeks. He nodded, already backing into the darkness. "Good night, Margaret," and disappeared into the night like a gentle ghost, leaving her with new thread and an old book. That night, Margaret couldn't sew. She sat on the narrow bed, book open in her lap, but the words blurred on the page. Her mind was elsewhere. It was in that moment at the door, in that simple gesture that meant so much more than it seemed. Eli hadn't tried to impress her, hadn't tried anything really. He'd just seen a need and filled it. When was the last time someone did that for you? The following days fell into a rhythm. Margaret sewed, orders increased, and every night, every single night, Eli appeared with some small excuse. Fabric that was left over, buttons that nobody would use. Once, just a cup of hot coffee because there was extra in the pot. They talked about books, about life on the trails he'd left behind, about the dreams Margaret had before Silas destroyed them. "Why did you leave the trails?" she asked one night. Eli was quiet for so long that Margaret thought she'd crossed some invisible line. Then he spoke, voice heavy with old sadness. "Lost my wife 3 years ago. Fever. I was driving cattle through Kansas, and when I got back she was already gone." He cleaned his glasses, a gesture Margaret learned he made when emotional. The trails lost their meaning after that. Margaret placed her hand over his, a simple but weighted gesture. "I'm so sorry." Eli turned his hand, intertwining fingers with hers. "Me too. But pain passes, never disappears, but it passes. And you learn that life goes on even when you think it can't." They stayed like that, hands joined, two survivors of different storms, finding shelter in each other. Is there anything more powerful than that? Two wounded hearts recognizing each other's pain? March came with freezing winds and news Margaret would have preferred not to hear. Silas Brennan was engaged, a 16-year-old girl who'd just arrived from Boston, small, delicate, exactly the type he'd described wanting. The news came through Mrs. Ruth, who didn't know whether to tell her or not. "Figured you'd rather hear it from me than street gossip," she explained. Margaret was sewing a wedding dress when she got the news. The irony wasn't lost on her. She pushed the needle into the fabric harder than necessary. "I hope she'll be happy," she said. And to her surprise, it was true. Not because she wished Silas well. That man could rot for all she cared. But because no girl deserved to be judged by her size, her weight, her appearance. No woman deserved that. "You all right?" Ruth asked, studying her face. Margaret nodded. "I'm better than all right. I'm free." And it was true. Something had shifted in her over the past weeks. It wasn't about proving to Silas he was wrong anymore. It was about proving to herself that she'd always been right. About herself. About her worth. About her strength. When do you stop living for others' approval? Eli noticed the change immediately that night. "You seem different," he commented, leaning against the doorframe the way he'd gotten used to doing. Margaret finished a seam before responding. "Silas is engaged." She waited for compassion, for pity, for some sign that he thought she should be devastated. But Eli just nodded. "And how do you feel about that?" "Relieved." The word came out honest, raw. "Should I be jealous? Should I be crying? Because all I can feel is gratitude. Gratitude that he showed who he was before I wasted years of my life finding out." Eli entered the room, something he'd never done before, always maintaining a respectful distance. But now he crossed that invisible line. "You know what I see when I look at you, Margaret." His voice was different, deeper, loaded with something that made her heart race. She couldn't answer, so she just shook her head. Eli removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly, then looked directly at her. "I see the strongest woman I've ever met. I see someone who got knocked down and got up, not just standing, but building. I see beauty that has nothing to do with size or shape, but with the fire that burns here." He touched lightly over her heart. The air between them was electrically charged. Margaret could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. Eli... She didn't know how to finish the sentence. Didn't need to. He leaned in slowly, giving her all the time in the world to pull away. But she didn't pull away. When his lips touched hers, it was like lighting a match in the dark, soft at first, then deeper, more urgent. When they separated, both were breathless. Eli rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done this weeks ago." Margaret laughed, a low, intimate sound. "Why didn't you?" He smiled against her lips. "Because I wanted to make sure you were seeing me. Not a substitute for him, not a solution to your loneliness, but me, Eli Cartwright, ex-cowboy with glasses and rough hands who reads Dickens." "I see you," Margaret whispered. "I've been seeing you for weeks, maybe since that first day at the store, when you nodded at me like I was a person, not a problem." They kissed again, and this time it was different. It was a promise, a beginning. Something neither of them planned, but both needed. Have you ever felt like you were in the right place, with the right person, at the right time? But of course the universe doesn't let happiness exist without testing its strength. 3 days later, Margaret was leaving the general store when she ran into Silas and his new fiancée. The girl really was tiny, with frightened eyes and hands that trembled holding her purse. Silas had the same arrogant look as always. "Margaret," he said as if he owned her name, "I see you're still around." "Dry Creek is my home now," she responded, keeping her voice even. Silas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you and Cartwright have been close. Makes sense. The reject and the rejected." The venom in his voice was palpable. His fiancée seemed to shrink even more. Margaret looked at the girl, saw the fear in her eyes, and something inside her shifted. "You know, Silas, you did me a favor that day at the station." Her voice was calm but firm. "Because if you'd accepted me, I would have spent my entire life trying to be small enough to fit into your limited vision of what a woman should be." She looked directly at the fiancé. "Good luck, you're going to need it." And then Margaret simply walked away, head high, step steady. She had better things to do than waste energy on small men. When was the last time you simply chose not to enter a fight that wasn't worth it? April brought wildflowers to the prairies around Dry Creek. Margaret watched the changes through her window while working on a special project. It wasn't an order. It was something for her, or rather for Eli. A quilt made of patches, pieces of fabric she'd been saving, fabric from the skirt she wore when she left Illinois. A piece from the first apron she sold, scraps from dresses she'd sewn for the town women. Each piece told a story. Together, they told her story, of how she'd arrived broken and rebuilt herself, stitch by stitch. The quilt was turning out beautiful, vibrant colors interwoven, patterns that danced before the eyes. Margaret worked on it every night after finishing her orders, tired fingers but determined. Have you ever created something just because you needed to give shape to what you felt? Eli didn't know about the project. He kept showing up every night with his small excuses and shy smiles. They talked about everything and nothing. Sometimes he'd read aloud while she sewed. His deep voice transformed Dickens's words into music. Other times they just stayed in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. "You've been hiding something," Eli commented one night, looking at the pile of fabrics Margaret had quickly covered when he entered. She smiled mysteriously. "Maybe." He leaned in, trying to see under the cloth. "Is it a dress?" Margaret swatted his hand away playfully. "It's a surprise, and you'll have to wait until it's ready." The truth was, Margaret was nervous. The quilt represented more than just sewn fabrics. It was an offering, a symbol. In the tradition her mother had taught her, giving a handmade quilt was like giving a piece of your soul. It was saying, "I trust you with my story." It was saying, "I want you to be part of the next chapter." It was saying, without words, "I love you." But how do you hand over something like that? How do you hand over your heart sewn in patches and hope the other person understands? Margaret was certain of her feelings. What she wasn't certain of was whether Eli was ready for what that quilt meant. He still carried the pain of his lost wife, still wore the wedding band on his finger. She'd noticed, even if he thought nobody saw. It was Mrs. Ruth who finally forced the issue. "Girl, you gonna sew till your fingers fall off, or you gonna give that man the quilt already?" Margaret looked up from her work, surprised. "How do you know?" Ruth laughed. "I know everything that happens in this house. And I know a woman in love when I see one. That quilt's been ready for a week. You're just scared." "What if he doesn't understand?" Margaret whispered, fear finally surfacing. "What if it's too soon? What if he's not ready?" Ruth sat beside her, picking up one of the patches. "Look at this here. Every piece different, every color unique. But together they make something beautiful. You're already ready. He's already ready. The only ones who don't know it yet are you two." That night, when Eli knocked on the door, Margaret was waiting with the quilt folded over her arms. He stopped in the doorway, eyes behind his glasses widening when he saw what she held. "Margaret." She extended the quilt to him, hands trembling slightly. "I made this for you. Every piece tells part of my journey since I got here. And I need you to know." Eli took the quilt, rough fingers tracing the patterns, recognizing some of the fabrics. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Do you know what this means? A patchwork quilt?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Eli carefully placed the quilt over the chair and then pulled Margaret into his arms. "I thought I'd never feel this again, thought my heart died with Sarah." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "But then you stepped off that train, and even rejected, even hurt. You didn't give up. You built a life here. And somehow, without me realizing it, you built a home in my heart." His hands framed her face. "Margaret, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Not on the outside, though you are, no matter what that idiot said. But on the inside, right here." He touched her heart again. "Eli Cartwright, are you courting me with pretty words, or are you going to do this right?" Margaret tried to sound stern, but couldn't hide her smile. He laughed, that rare laugh that transformed his entire face. Then, to her complete surprise, he knelt down. "Margaret, I don't have much. Don't have land like some men. Don't have a big house. All I have are hands that work, a heart that finally started beating again, and the promise that I'll see you, really see you, every day for the rest of my life." Tears flowed freely down her face now. "That's all I ever wanted, to be seen." Eli stood up, pulling her into a kiss that was promise and gift and future all rolled into one. When they separated, he held her close. "So will you marry me? Let this tired old cowboy make you happy for the rest of your days?" "Yes." The word came out without hesitation. 1,000 times, yes. They stood there, embraced in the small room that had witnessed so much transformation. So much pain turned into strength. Outside, Dry Creek continued its normal life. But inside that room, two hearts that had been broken found healing in each other. Is there anything more powerful than that? Have you ever experienced love that doesn't demand you be smaller, but celebrates you exactly as you are? Margaret and Eli married under a flowering dogwood in May, when spring exploded in colors all across Wyoming. She wore a dress she'd made especially for the occasion. Simple white with delicate embroidery, designed not to impress, but to express. Eli removed the ring he'd worn for 3 years, and with trembling but certain hands, placed a new one on Margaret's finger. Her story spread through Dry Creek and beyond, not the version Silas tried to tell, but the truth. The woman who was rejected and transformed, rejection into rebirth. The seamstress who sewed not just clothes but an entire life with her own hands. People started coming from neighboring towns just to meet Margaret. The woman who proved you were never too small or too big for the right love. You're just you, and for the right person, that's more than enough. And now I want to hear from you. What was the moment when someone finally truly saw you? When did you realize you didn't need to change to be loved? Share your story in the comments, because maybe your journey is exactly what someone needs to hear today to find the courage to rebuild. Your story matters. You matter exactly as you are.